It's very hard to speak for somebody's circumstance. Like, for example, if I didn't grow up a certain type of lifestyle, I can't make comments on certain type of cultures because they'll say, what do you know? You've never came from there. So when you stand up for things like gun rights, there's people that have lost family members from mass shootings. They've had people that have been murdered from guns. So their opinions are very, very strong on anti-guns. Your family has been murdered by, I'm sorry to say this, but has been murdered by guns. How is your feeling towards weapons in America?
I mean, my feeling is exactly as you stated it. I have, my uncle, my father were killed by guns, but I also, I have spent years of my life. I was born in Virginia. I lived 2 years in Alabama. I lived a year in rural South Dakota. I was in rural Alabama, Lowndes County, and you don't get more rural than that. And so I've spent a lot of my time, and because I'm, a hunter and a fisherman, I spent a lot of my time with people, with rural people in our country, who have this very, very visceral relationship with gun culture, and they see it as essential to who they are. And, the idea of taking a gun away from that person for them, it's existential. It means the end of their freedoms. So I believe in the Constitution, including the Second Amendment. And, as president, I'm not going to take anybody's guns away. I wasn't really raised in that culture, but I understand it, and I understand that those feelings need to be respected, they need to be understood, and that if we're going to get some kind of what people would call sensible gun controls, that people mentally ill can't get them, we need to all come together on that. And right at this point, we're also polarized that nobody can come together, and that anything anybody does is just going to increase the polarization. I say this too, and this is controversial, and people come after me because I've mentioned this before. We also need to understand what's causing these mass shootings in schools. It's utterly unacceptable that any kid in our country gets killed by a mass shooter, and it's happening every 21 hours. We're seeing mass shootings in our country. Why is this happening? It does not seem to have anything to do with an increase in guns. The mass shootings began over the last 20 years, and there was no dramatic increase or dramatic gun legislation that went through during that time. When I was a kid, we had gun clubs in my schools, and people came to schools with their rifles.
Really?
And yes.
Was anybody ever a threat?
No, and nobody. They're never in human history.
Do you think it's video games or?
Well, let me say that because I think that's something that should be looked at.
Well, when I saw Grand Theft Auto and everybody, there's a 7-year-old kid having fun beating up a prostitute and shooting at a cop. To me, I'm like, that can't be healthy. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, just can't be healthy. Like, I mean, back in the day, like my parents would be very involved with what I'm looking at and watching and being absorbed by. Like. So now these kids are just buying games online with mom and dad's cards, and they have no idea what they're playing. They have no idea what they're doing on their iPads. I think social media and video games, if it's not properly controlled, is dangerous more than drugs.
Yeah, and I don't know how my kids even navigated it, and the availability of porn and all that stuff on the internet.
That's
is
fine.
Crazy.
I'm just kidding.
No, don't get
You
rid of
leave
that.
my porn out. I was kidding. No, that's terrible.
But it's hard. Our kids have a harder time navigating all this stuff than we do. And with us, our parents that get out of the house, lock the door, and don't come back until it's dark.
Yeah.
And the dinner bell rings, and then and all they had to worry about was that we'd step in a bear trap or something out in the woods, or fall in the creek or whatever. But now there's all kinds of stuff happening in your house, and you have no idea what world your kid has entered. So but something happened, because there's never been a time in human history when strangers would walk into a gathering of children or even strangers and just started shooting them. That just has never happened. Was
there as much guns back in the day?
Well, there's always been, a proliferation of guns in our country. There wasn't a sudden proliferation that explains why that started happening. And there's other nations that have, comparable levels of guns to us. For example, Switzerland. There's a gun in every home in Switzerland. It's a law. And
wait, they make it mandatory for you?
Yeah.
Why?
It's self-defense. There's they have a self-defense system called the canton system, where I think everybody in the country is required to have some military training and then to keep a weapon in their house. The last mass shooting they had was 21 years ago. We have them every 21 hours. So what? It's not the guns, right?
What do you think it is?
I think we need to look at that. And actually, NIH should be looking at it. NIH has a rule that they passed in 1997 that forbids any money being spent to study the etiology of gun violence. So they don't want to know. And I will change that rule, when I go in there, and I'll make them to study it. But there are a lot of, it's outside the Overton window. There are things you can't study. You can't study the link between vaccines and chronic disease. You can't study, the links between high fructose corn syrup and the obesity epidemic, because there's somebody powerful that they don't want to expose. And
that's wild.
And so exactly the kind of studies they ought to be doing, they're not doing. And this is one. 1997, you can go look it up. They adopted a rule or regulation that makes it illegal to spend any federal science money studying the etiology and the origins of gun violence. Now,
this is crazy.
Because with every problem, there's a root. And so if you're not finding the root of it, you're not going to fix the solution. We're just putting Band-Aids on things.
Shawna, of course. And now, here are possibilities. When the Columbine was one of the first, acts of mass violence by a stranger, against strangers. And I believe there were 5 victims or families of victims in that attack who sued Prozac and said, that the killer was on Prozac. Prozac has a black box warning that says it causes homicidal and suicidal behavior. All the SSRIs do, and in fact, in their clinical trials, there were terrible, terrible signals of homicidal and suicidal behavior, very, very devastating signals. So, there's a widespread suspicion that this epidemic of gun violence that we're seeing is being caused by the proliferation of SSRIs. I think there's 120 million prescriptions written a year for maybe Prozac, 120 million for other SSRIs, benzos. And another 120 million, for Adderall, right? And so you've got a whole generation on these drugs that have black box warnings that say this causes the kind of behavior that you would associate with these mass shootings. So that's one issue. Another is just social media. Is that to it? But nobody else has the addiction to SSRIs that we have in this country. And that could explain why the gun violence is different here than elsewhere. I'm not saying it is the answer. I'm saying it ought to be studied. It's hard to study. You can't really study it without NIH help because of the HIPAA law. So when these mass shootings start, isn't the first question you would ask at a mass shooting, was that shooter on SSRIs? When an athlete dies on the playing field, don't you want to say, was he vaccinated? They'll never print that in the paper. They'll never tell you the answer. The first question that comes to your head, was he vaccinated? Did he drop dead on the playing field, the healthiest person that you could find? Was that mass shooter on SSRIs? You'll never find that out because the HIPAA laws make it illegal to give that information. So you need NIH to come in, and you need them to adopt a rule that says in mass shooting cases, this is a question that we're going to answer. And then do the study of all the mass shooting cases, and you can easily find out. You can easily go back in time because each one of these shooters had an HMO, and they had an insurance plan that was paying for their drugs if they were on them. So let's find out if they were on them or if they recently got off them, because that is one of the things they found when you recently got off them. That's when a lot of the suicide, the violent behavior, starts. It could be social media. It could be video games. It's something happened, and the guns do not seem to be a covariable, because there was no increase in guns. There was no increase in gun legislation. Something else changed. Something else changed that we need to explain, and it's happening. The fact that it's happening here and it's not happening in other parts of the world, that's a tip. And that is, something that needs to be taken into consideration.
I'm so glad that you are and that you've looked into that. Truly.
My question is this, and not to be disrespectful, I hate when I talk like this because people in the comment section are like, oh, shut up, blah, blah, blah. But I'm new, so I'm asking dumb questions in this field. If we have so much money to help our neighbors, which, thank God we are in a situation where we could help neighbors, and I don't know the reasons why we would or what we would. I'm just saying we have the funds and the abilities to help our neighbors. That being said, why are we not putting more security in schools? And I feel like that could just save the issue right there. And I might be stupid for saying this, but a lot of people are arm the teachers. Dude, the teachers have enough on their plate. They're raising our future government. They're raising our future kids. They're raising our future, I don't know if he's going to be a president or a lawyer or a doctor, or maybe somebody who's going to fight this vaccine shit, or I don't know what it is, but they have enough on their hands. A guy who's teaching English has never even shot a 9mm. He doesn't need to be strapped, but if we could send billions out to a different country, why can't we put police officers in that county in schools? So if, God forbid, a child that's a lunatic that comes in with that idea, before even the first round goes off, he's down on the ground immediately. Is this a stupid question to ask?
No, I asked that question too, and I've asked Gavin DeBecker, who is probably the leading security guy in the country. How do you do this? And until we identify the cause of it. That's what we need to be doing. People don't walk with guns onto airplanes. We'd figure that out. And if we have to do the same thing at schools, let's do it. These are our most precious assets.
9/11 happened one time. Now I can't bring a water bottle through the airport. You know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to make a joke, but we had how many children's dropped to the ground for them to make a reason to help these children? I don't know why they need to figure out why it's happening before you solve the problem. If we're at an intersection and there's car accidents, there's kids dying from this all that, I'm not going to sit up let's keep making this happen until I figure out why this is happening. It's no, let's shut down the street right now and figure this out later.
Yeah.
To me, it just...
to continue that metaphor, if you're bleeding out, you don't need to figure out exactly what made the cut. Let's stop the bleeding, and then we'll figure it out.
Exactly. I feel like there's a lot of common sense that's not so common.